All right. What a show today. We had a lot of content covered throughout the whole session, and I hope everyone's enjoying. I appreciate those that are here live with me, and those that will be watching later. I look forward to comments within our platform. So feel free to ask questions and participate as we proceed here. My session is titled Death, Taxes, and Ransomware. And one of the reasons that came to mind was this Benjamin Franklin quote: "In this world, nothing is certain but debt and taxes." And then lately, it seemed every morning I woke up, there was something going on related to ransomware. Uh, so, as you heard some of the folks earlier, it's not a matter of time if you'll be hacked, it's when. And now it seems ransomware, at some point in our lifetime within cyber, we will face a ransomware incident. So I think that's kind of where I was going towards, and hopefully all of you see it the same way. On the slide, you can see here a little highlight there in blue from a White House memo. Use a third-party pen tester. So I think the government kind of sees what's going on based on all the latest hacks, especially that SolarWinds supply chain attack. I think we're going to get more and more guidance. But the most important part here is the adversary is always ahead of us and at a very fast pace. So how do we keep up with them? So that's the goal of my talk today. And hopefully you've seen that across all the other presentations today as well. My agenda, I'll talk a little bit about who I am and what I do here at Pantera, a little bit about my background. We'll talk about the founding principles of ransomware and what that ultimately means. I go into a little bit of a case study, very technical kind of guidance through a attack chain as it relates to ransomware and different layers of detection and response we can address it with. And then finally, where do we go from here? So my name is Arif Khan. I'm a senior director here at Pentera in North America, handling the services, so everything related to technical capabilities of the platform. I have over 15 years experience designing and implementing complex security solutions. A lot of my time was doing offensive security services, such as red team operations, incident response, and computer forensics at Mandiant. So when I came to Pantera, I saw how the automation can help decrease the gap between the adversary and our defensive capabilities. So a little bit about the evolution of ransomware and when it all started. I couldn't put it all into one slide, so I tried to pick some of the more important factors. It all started in 1989 when this academic, Joseph Popp, distributed over 20,000 disks, which had malware, right? It was related to a AIDS conference. So there was a lot of interest around the event, and the individual took advantage of that by giving actual disks to the mailing list, and people just popped into their computers. Quick, a couple of reboots, the malware would take place, and it ultimately asked for, I think it was $189 ransom. As we kept moving forward, 2007 to 2010, that's when the whole lockerware ransomware came about. Instead of encrypting files, this ransomware prevented the normal operation of a computer. Victims were required to buy an activation key to unlock their system. In 2008, invention of Bitcoin didn't help the whole kind of payment systems. Before it was, I think, money orders and wires. Bitcoin kind of helped make payments faster and even try to hide your tracks. In 2011, came the GP code ransomware. The first versions had a very custom-written encryption mechanism. It was easily broken. The attackers evolved. The next variant came out with symmetric encryption, but we were able to recover the key, so it made it a little bit easier to get your stuff back. But in late 2010, there was a new version. It used a stronger encryption, RSA 1024 or AES 256, and it physically overwrote the file, making it literally impossible to recover your material. So the attacker evolves just as technology evolves, just as the risks evolve. So we need to stay kind of again, we can't get ahead of them, but we can stay close to them. In 2016, 2017, Petya completely bricked infected machines by targeting the MFT, the master file table, but it was difficult to distribute. Again, the adversary learned. WannaCry came out. It infected over 500,000 devices worldwide by just incorporating the exploit for Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue being a very easy mechanism to move laterally once you're in an organization. And then finally, NotPetya encrypted the file table in such a way that most of the time recovery was not even possible. Here in 2017, the first kind of record was made. A $1 million ransom was paid by a South Korean web hosting provider. Obviously, that number is totally skewed now with some of the latest trends and headlines. And finally, 2020, rising scale of ransomware infections and all kinds of different extortion schemes. As was mentioned earlier in our day, it's a great business model, right? It's scalable. There's all kinds of different ways you can get revenue, whether it be a monthly subscription. You can have affiliates working for you where you can share profits, or maybe you just want to do a one-time license and get started. The ransomware as a service kind of changed the game, where it made non-technical individuals take advantage of this malware, take advantage of the moneymaker. And I'm kind of saying it here first, right? There's an ARR, annual recurring ransom. It's a business. They have this money coming in. They're going to just keep evolving the platform and changing the mechanisms behind the scenes. And what we're seeing lately, in early 2020, ransomware groups took it to the next level where they created this double extortion tactic. So instead of just encrypting the files and demanding a payment for the keys, now they're going to threaten you by leaking the data. So imagine you're a healthcare organization. Your data is already encrypted and gone. Hopefully you have a backup. But now the attackers are saying, we're going to drop all this on the internet or the dark web unless you pay this ransom. So again, more pressure being assigned. And lately, a new tactic has been detected by researchers over at Checkpoint: triple extortion. Encrypt the files, pressure you to pay the ransom or it's going to be posted publicly, but then the individuals potentially are being contacted. So imagine my health records are out there now in the hands of a threat actor. They now call me and say, hey, look, we have your records. We're going to post it publicly unless you pay. So they kind of have two lines of income potentially. And look, it's a scary thing to face or have that phone call. And obviously the business is booming. Was mentioned earlier by Matai, $20 billion predicted this year. And again, this was from a 2017 report. These numbers are probably ultimately skewed based on the latest trends we're seeing this year. In addition, organizations have more than doubled as far as being affected by ransomware. Specifically, healthcare and utility sectors are being targeted. On the right side, you see here the average payment for, depending on the strand, Maze was at $420,000. Ryuk was $282,000. These numbers are going to keep changing this year, I think, because of all the trends we're seeing and the different headlines of organizations being affected. Here's just a few highlighted industries that are being targeted. So the first, the world's largest meat processing company, $11 million ransom was paid. In the center there, the largest fuel pipeline in the United States paid the $5 million ransom. I believe the FBI was able to recover, if I recall correctly, 2 point something of that from the blockchain. But again, that's not always possible, so I wouldn't look forward to that. And lastly, I think one of the highest I've seen thus far, a cyber insurance firm paying $40 million for a ransom. And these are just some of the ones that have gone public. Based on my experience doing incident response, a lot of the time organizations don't go public. So we're probably missing a good amount of metrics regarding the payment of ransoms. A commonality I've seen across the board when it comes to organizations and kind of their root cause or initial point of compromise. Most of the time, it's either social engineering, right? Phishing, an email comes in, the victim executes a payload, and ultimately has a foothold in the environment. So a lot of the times, when I did social engineering exercises, if one payload didn't get through, I changed it up and kept trying different invasive techniques to try to get into my target organization. So the attackers are doing the same thing. Drive-by downloading, visiting a website that potentially takes advantage of a vulnerability in your browser. Again, more recently, we're seeing vulnerabilities in Chrome, Edge, some being 0-day. Attackers are taking advantage of this. So you visit a website you trust, potentially behind the scenes, there's a script or something else that was compromised, and again, infects the victim's computer. Then there's vulnerabilities in your external attack surface, such as your VPN infrastructure, your firewalls. A lot of the headlines we saw this year as we moved to the kind of remote lifestyle, Pulse Secure VPN, Sonic Wall, Big IP. The attackers are looking into these devices now because, again, they're good target points to get into your organization. And most of the time, it's not in your control as far as when the patches will be released, how much you can actually harden those systems. And lastly, there's remote access services, whether it be RDP, VPN. These are taking advantage of potentially compromised credentials. If you go on the dark web, you can buy credentials, right, from different types of password dumps that have happened. A lot of the time, individuals, you reuse passwords across different platforms. So it may not be necessarily your organization that was compromised, but it could have been a third party. Then the attacker tries them against your organization based on just open source intelligence, trying to figure out, hey, where does this person work? And then they easily get in. MFA is great, but even today, there's capabilities of bypassing MFA, jumping in the middle of MFA. So I wouldn't trust it completely. I think number one is making sure your users are aware, change passwords often, and then have good visibility for your remote access services. So now we'll talk a little bit about Ryuk. Again, it's a ransomware variant. I'd like to go into the chain. We'll talk about different layers of what it's trying to do, and then different mentions of detections. So here from Microsoft's technical team, this is a Ryuk attack chain. As you can see, the starting point for just kind of infecting you with ransomware, it's already past the initial compromise, right? Your email, web, and endpoint security are already gone. They're out of the picture as far as your defensive stack. The attacker leveraged the initial access point through TrickBot. TrickBot, when it first came out, was a malware whose major function was to originally steal banking credentials, and then ultimately kept adding functionality and features, stealing other credentials from your browser. And finally, the operators extended the capability so much, it's a whole ecosystem. You can buy, add features, remote desktop, VNC, deliver other payloads. A lot of the time when I used to do incident response and I would come across different malware in this family, we called it commodity malware. Most of the time we didn't think much of it, but sometimes later in the process of hunting for the evil, we found that it was related. So when you see TrickBot or other similar botnet type malware, you want to make sure you investigate, because it could be an entry point to a totally advanced attacker who's taking advantage of just, renting out the TrickBot botnet and coming into your network to infect you with ransomware. So again, on the right side there in red, you can see the different MITRE techniques. For me personally, ransomware as a whole is all similar as far as what they do through the life cycle, right? They deliver a foothold, whether it be Cobalt Strike, PowerShell, or any other C2 type system. Then they do reconnaissance. Then they move laterally. They drop more tools. And then finally, they want to encrypt you, right? So we want to make sure at the different stages of the attacker lifecycle, you have detection capabilities. Here, as I mentioned, the adversary is trying to move laterally, right? How do they do that? They use different living off the LAN tools, NLTest, NetGroup, AD-Find. They dropped an actual executable on your endpoint, and they started just performing reconnaissance. And most organizations may not have a hunting team or a blue team. They may have a managed SOC provider that is monitoring for certain behavior. A long time ago, we used to look for indicators of compromise because the attacker was already in. But we need to change that because we need to be more proactive. We need to look for behavior. When you see these tools being executed, you don't want it to drown in a 1,000, 2,000 list of alerts. That's where you get tired of looking at things and you miss the little things as far as the early stages of the attacker. If you can catch them early, you can save yourself a lot of work later. And CrowdStrike has this term breakout time, which is the time it takes for an intruder to begin moving laterally beyond the initial compromise. The average breakout time in 2019 was 9 hours. In 2020, it was 4 hours and 28 minutes. So the window's getting smaller to catch that attacker before they move laterally. At the same time, CrowdStrike said there's a 1-10-60 rule, where intrusions should be detected in 1 minute, investigated in 10, and remediated within 60. That's a lot of quickness that you need to execute. Not all organizations can do that. For my time at Mandiant, I think it was around average 300-400 days before organizations kind of contained the whole thing and remediated. I think I read an article yesterday. The average now was around 208. So again, most of this data is based on public compromises. We don't see a lot of the other incidents that happen that organizations don't go public. There's tools out there that can help organizations without a blue team, without an incident response team, without a managed SOC provider like Sysmon. It's a powerful monitoring tool that you can configure on your endpoints, look for these different types of commands and behaviors, and then centralize it into a platform like some of our partners mentioned, Exabeam. So you can start creating signatures for that behavior. Here, as the adversary keeps moving in the kill chain, now they want to get higher privileged accounts. So they want to dump credentials. They want to take hashes, maybe pass the hash into other systems. So now the adversary is using TrickBot, which has an implementation of this password dumper. And ultimately, the behaviors are always the same, right? Dumping LSAS, dumping the hives. So you're not going to miss whether it's Mimikatz or this tool or hash dump or Metasploit. They're all using similar techniques. So you can create behavioral indicators that can help you find the attacker in different stages of the attack kill chain. And similarly, Sysmon can help you monitor for this behavior as well. I won't get into kind of deep technical talk there. That's probably a whole presentation in itself. But you want to make sure that you have full visibility into different layers of the kill chain, because when you get towards the latter half, it's too late. When the attacker's already kind of taking your data, making copies, exfiltrating it to their C2, it's too late. They already have copies. They're just about to pull the trigger and start encrypting. Yes, there's things you can look for at this stage. For example, mutexes within memory, lateral movement, moving faster within the organization. So similar to what was mentioned earlier by Exabeam, you can have signature behaviors that show you anomalies, right? Here's how the service account behaved previously, and now all of a sudden it's spiking, it's hitting more systems. So kind of catch it. But again, your data most likely has already left the organization, and the attacker is just about to just start encrypting your endpoints. Common preventative measures that you can probably read all across the internet, all different vendors, they all have different checklists. I won't get into all of them today, but let's say in your existing stack, you want to train your end users to spot and report phishing emails, right? You want to make sure, especially in this remote time, that they keep forwarding suspicious emails to a centralized mailbox where your incident response team, your security operations team investigates. You don't want to miss that initial vector before it's too late. Additionally, patch management is very important. I still see today Eternal Blue widely in the environment, multiple environments. So you want to make sure those critical vulnerabilities that Microsoft has released patches for, you implement very fast as soon as they're available. Disable protocols that you don't need, right? Remote desktop should never be on the outside. So get rid of it. Why is it there? So making sure you have visibility into that. Internally, take advantage of isolating boxes that you use remote desktop for versus managing your environment. We can get into extending controls and get even stronger with hardening our environments. Limit workstation to workstation communications, right? Limit SMB to SMB. A lot of the time, ransomware looks for open shares, takes credentials, is probably compromised on one endpoint, and tries them against others that use SMB. So you don't need to have all workstations communicating with each other. You want to start limiting that access. We can implement kind of the common fundamentals of security, least privilege, right? Take away permissions to files, folders, and databases that organizations or individuals don't need. So making sure you track who's accessing what, and you centralize everything and not have multiple copies everywhere, potentially at risk. And then we get into those continuous preventative measures. And this is the most important to me because you can have the stack, you can have those hardening controls, but how do you make sure they keep working? How do you measure them? And so backups is important, right? There's a 3-2-1 backup rule. Retain at least 3 separate copies of your data in 2 different storage types, with one being offline. Okay, sounds extreme. Maybe you don't need to go that far, but backups are important, especially your sensitive files and your critical files. Training, security awareness training, user training is important. You know, when I used to do it at Mandiant, we would do it 2 to 3 times a year with our organizations. And so making sure the users are always aware of the cutting edge malware, the latest threats. You always want to make sure there's a path to communication because, you know, a cliche, security is only as strong as your weakest link. Sometimes the users are your weakest link. And lastly, as we mentioned earlier from the White House, most of you have done it, penetration testing. Some organizations do it just to satisfy a checkbox. Great, you want to be compliant, but it's not working anymore. It's a classic model. In my opinion, it was great going to my customers and doing a penetration test 1 week, 2 weeks, time box. But after I left and we came back the following year, a lot of the time those vulnerabilities still existed. And we just literally gave them the same report over and over again. Organizations don't always have the time to remediate, or they just want to satisfy that checkbox. So penetration testing is very important to validate that the stack, the controls are all working appropriately. Of course, there's tools and preventative measures built in Windows. Windows 10 has this ransomware protection section. You can point to certain folders. It'll give you an extra layer of protection. It's a nice to have, right? Microsoft is evolving, knowing the threats that its users are facing. So it's a nice starting point as far as just your own Windows endpoint goes. Next, this is an example of Sysmon. You can do monitoring for different behaviors or indicators. Here's an example of lateral movement. You can see here the source and target systems. I don't have the full details there, but you'll see NTLM, so it's a pass the hash attack. So creating these configurations and centralizing it in your already existent stack, like a SIM, is important to make sure you have visibility into these different stages of the attack. Next, you can get pretty advanced. Here's an example of a Yara signature for the ransomware shown here. You can see here from McAfee, there's only certain strings you can look for because the attack group will change, right? If you create this signature, the attack group will keep changing it. So again, you'll never be 100% up to speed, but this also requires some technical skill set. Do you have somebody on your team that can create these Yara signatures? If not, do you have a network detection tool that is continuously updated. Okay, great. How do you know it's going to catch this behavior or the next behavior? So you want to make sure you have that visibility. And just kind of the way I see it is you have a defense in depth. You need to validate it in depth, right? Making sure you're testing from your firewalls to your NDR to your EDR to phishing exercises, every layer of the defensive stack. But how do you validate your readiness, right? I already mentioned I'm calling penetration testing 1.0. When I used to go do those engagements, there was literally 3 to 5 months of overhead, of logistics, scheduling, contracts, statement of work. Then when we were finally able to schedule time to go on site, we executed the penetration test, delivered a report. Most of the time, it was time boxed. Hey, you have only 1 week to do this, 2 weeks to do this. Great. Once I delivered the report, it was a point in time. Tomorrow could have been totally different as far as their exposure goes. They could have implemented a new device, a new platform, a new solution, went to the cloud. When you rush to do things, it leaves room for mistakes and opens a gap within your organizations. So I already came in. I'll be back in a year to do my next penetration test to point that out, unless you continuously test your environment. Vulnerability scanners. We all use them. We most likely all have them, or a third party uses them for us. You see a lot of vulnerabilities identified. HTTPS using their own version, SSL version 1. But according to Gartner, only a very small percentage of those vulnerabilities are actually being exploited by attackers, right? The attackers want to take advantage of best bang for their buck, right? The return on investment. So I'm going to go exploit Eternal Blue because 75% of organizations still have that one legacy system they can't decommission, still have that system they forgot. The developer set up a rogue server, didn't patch it, forgot about it. So attackers want to take advantage of this, and they're not going to go target you specifically unless it's going to be, again, best bang for their buck. They're in the supply chain. Okay, this security vendor, everyone has this firewall. I'm going to target them. I'm going to find a vulnerability that no one knows about. Okay, great. Vulnerability scanners don't know about them either. If FireEye never went public, would we know about SolarWinds? Most likely not before it's too late. So we always want to think about the unknown. Great, you have the scanner. It scans for known signatures, but what can we do to account for that which is not public yet? And lastly, attack simulation. It's a nice concept. It was good when it started because there was nothing else. But the simulations are prescriptive, right? They don't know the nuisances of your organization. You need to make intelligent choices about which simulations to run. You also need people that have the skill sets to run simulations based on intelligence about the threats to your organizations and industry. Then figure out the assets, then make sure the expertise regarding detection and prevention. There's a lot of overhead just to get started. You have to define a playbook. There needs to be something better. There's something faster to get you going. In addition, scenarios from those simulation tools do not include exploits because they just can't. So how do you evaluate your readiness? How do you look at data that's not there and determine if you're safe? And that's kind of the simulation, right? If there's no forensic artifacts, there's no actual authentications, there's no actual dropping of payloads, are you really ready? And that's kind of where I'm going to plug Pantera. It was mentioned throughout the presentations today. Ransomware is very kind of evolving. Business is booming. How do we get ready for the next ransomware attack, but potentially any other threat that might come after? So here you have your defensive stack, right? These are tools you may all have. You might have some of them, whether it's from the endpoint, the network, the user, the enterprise. Here's the external attack surface. So you have Maze, Arif, Ryuk, whatever ransomware variant that might be targeting your organization. Then you have the kind of internal attack chain, right? We mentioned Ryuk, but this could be any. They launch the attack, they inject into processes, they exploit vulnerabilities, they start to encrypt the data. They go through the different layers of your stack. So again, in depth. And then finally, they exfiltrate the data. What we've done with Pantera is to emulate this whole kill chain within the platform in a safe manner. We don't want to cause any denial of services. We don't want to crash your environment, but we want you to emulate actual ransomware in your organization so that you can test each layer of the stack and make sure that they're configured appropriately and that they're doing their job, whether it be managed by you or a third party. And then as attackers evolve and change the malware coming in, Pentera gets continuous updates, up-to-date techniques, tactics, and procedures. And you can continuously run that task over and over again, get a nice resilience score that, hey, you're trending average, you're trending above average, you have room for improvement. That way you actually have data you're looking at within the organization. And then finally, at the end, you now have all findings centralized in a nice looking report that you can deliver to your executives. Say, hey, look, I've been running Pantera ransomware ready module. We're good. We're solid. It's leveraged every technique that the actual attackers are leveraging. And my platform, I feel relatively safe. That concludes my presentation. I appreciate everyone's time. I hope all the content presented today was valuable in some form or another. And again, remember, use the platform. Recordings will be available. And thank you very much.